This is the latest in the series of seminars brought to you by ESS, City St George's, University of London, and the National Centre for Social Research. I'm Eric Harrison. I'm Deputy Director of ESS at headquarters in London. Today's speaker is Lisa Calderwood, Professor Lisa Calderwood from University College London. Lisa will be well known to all of you who are interested in longitudinal work of this kind. She's got a long series of body of work going back several years related to a number of UK cohort studies. Today, she's going to be talking about something more prospective, feasibility study for potential new UK birth cohort. Just before Lisa gets started, just to remind you that as ever, you can post your questions for Lisa using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So that's the Q&A function, please, not the chat. And then I will attempt to field as many of these questions at the end and put them to Lisa. Okay, looking forward to listening to this talk. Lisa, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Eric, for your very kind introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. So today I'm going to be talking about a feasibility study for a new birth cohort. And before I get started, just to acknowledge all my co-authors of this paper. It's very much a team science effort on the first slide there. So what is the early life cohort feasibility study? So the kind of core aims of the feasibility study are to kind of draw and recruit into a UK representative study of babies in the first year of life. And the target age for recruitment was around 9 months. And one of the kind of main, very key focus for the feasibility study was around inclusivity and creating an inclusive cohort. So including families that are typically represented in large-scale social surveys. We wanted to test the feasibility of a range of different innovative measures as well as data linkages. And throughout the project, we've engaged extensively to ensure kind of scientific and policy value, public acceptability and participant co-production. So we've been working on the study for a few years now. It's since April 2021, and it's coming to an end shortly, next month, in fact. And it's been funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. So I'll say a bit more about the kind of next steps looking forward to the hopefully a future main study at the end of the presentation. So this slide just shows the team, scientific team working on the study. So I'm one of 3 co-directors along with Professor Alyssa Goodman at UCL and also Professor Pasco Fioron, who's at UCL and also Cambridge. And we've got a kind of very wide team of collaborators covering all 4 nations of the UK. And next slide, please. Thanks. So the feasibility study has got several different kind of elements to it. I'm going to be talking today about the large-scale survey element, which is going to be the main focus of the talk for today, and is the sort of main part of the kind of project. We also separately tested some more innovative measures, including things like eye tracking, and with a sort of on a smaller scale, which is what we call the ELC+ study. And we did some scoping work around the inclusion of children in need in a future feasibility in a future cohort, and also separately the ESRC have also commissioned a scoping study looking at qualitative data collection. So I'm going to focus on the main survey component, and I also wanted to just mention Ipsos, who we're working with on the main survey component and also the ELC+ study. So I'm going to start off by giving you an overview of the design of the study, and then I'm going to move on to talking about some of the fieldwork innovations and showing you some results and findings from the fieldwork. And then I'm going to wrap up towards the end by talking about engagement and inclusivity. So the sort of design features that we incorporated to kind of create that inclusive cohort, and a bit more about the public engagement work that we did. So the survey component, so first of all, just to give you an overview of the sort of timetable for the survey. So for the feasibility study, the birth window was a sort of 2-month birth window. So the babies were born in England, Wales and Scotland in November and December 2022. And in Northern Ireland, we had a slightly later birth window in June and July 2023. And the fieldwork started back in 2023, towards the end of 2023 in England, Wales and Scotland, and finished in sort of spring, summer this year in those countries. And we started a bit later in Northern Ireland in April this year and finished up in September. So the feasibility study is coming to an end now, as I mentioned earlier, and we're aiming to deposit the data from the feasibility study with the UK Data Service later on in the year, around about mid-June next year. So first of all, just to say a bit about the sampling and recruitment approach. So the sampling frame for the study was based on details provided by the birth registration, so the information that parents provide when they register a birth, linked to National Health Service and Public Health Scotland maternity records. So this is the record that the NHS has of essentially of the birth happening in the NHS kind of system. There are many benefits to using this sampling frame. So it has very high population coverage. We have a kind of rich set of variables which from these data sources, which tell us some things about the family and about the baby, which we are able to use to look at representativity and to look at non-response analysis and produce weights. Very importantly, the maternity records included baby's ethnicity. So we've used baby's ethnicity to do an individual level ethnic boost sample. And for the feasibility study, that was just in England. Another great benefit of this sampling frame is that it allows us to independently recruit fathers and mothers. Because when the baby's birth is registered, both fathers and mothers' names are provided and addresses are provided on the birth registration. And this allows us to write directly to mothers and fathers, and also importantly, where the mother and father are not living together, we can write separately to them at different addresses. The chart there on the slide just shows that at birth registration, actually quite a high proportion of parents are actually living at different addresses. So that's been a benefit from the design of this sampling frame. I should just mention before we move on, that in Northern Ireland it was slightly different. So that in Northern Ireland the sample was only based on maternity records. So we were not able to kind of do this sort of separate direct recruitment of mothers and fathers, but mothers and fathers, where they were very much still included in the study. So yeah, this slide just shows the sample design. So we had ethnic minority boosts in England for Pakistani and Bangladeshi babies, and Black African and Black Caribbean babies, and they were combined for the purposes of the feasibility study. We also had a very major low-income boost as well, which was based on area level deprivation. So that was the 20% most deprived lower super output areas. And as you can see for the England sample, the sample itself was very heavily sort of skewed towards these boost samples for the feasibility study. And we also have boost samples in the smaller UK countries, so in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland also. Okay, we can move on, thanks. So this slide just gives an overview of the sort of recruitment approach. So the first stage was that what we referred to as a notification mailing was sent to families, which was informing them that they had the opportunity to be part of the study. This was a letter we wrote separately to each parent named on the sampling frame. So they had their own separate letter and envelope, it informs them they've got the opportunity to be part of the study, but also gives them the opportunity to opt out if they don't wish to hear any more about it. And that was sent about a month or so before the start of the fieldwork. Then at the beginning of fieldwork, the interviewers sent an invitation mailing, which included a letter and also another letter and also a more detailed leaflet. I should say that the notification mailing, again, just reflecting a slight country difference. In Northern Ireland, the notification mailing was sent by the data holders, the data controllers, whereas in England, Scotland and Wales, the notification mailing was sent by the fieldwork agency, which was Ipsos. So the fieldwork started, the interviewers sent out their invitation mailing, and then they visited the family at their home address. And then we had a kind of period of fieldwork. I'll say a bit more about the mode design in a moment, but it was primarily face-to-face. After the main fieldwork finished, we had a non-response web follow-up, which was a shorter interview. And throughout the kind of recruitment approach, as well as kind of using kind of best practice protocols, fieldwork protocols around call patterns and things like this, and we also have used unconditional and conditional incentives, and again I'll talk a bit more about that. So this is the name of the study for the participants. So we didn't call it the Early Life Cohort Feasibility Study, we called it Generation New Era. And you can see the logo there, and the other image is the sort of front of the main study guide, which was sent by the interviewers at the start of the fieldwork. So about the questionnaire, content and informants and the mode. So this slide just shows the sort of scientific themes that we tried to incorporate, and the scientific kind of topics, I guess, that we tried to incorporate when we were designing the questionnaire. I'm not going to read them out or go through them in detail, but I think those of you who are familiar with kind of birth cohort studies or birth cohort research will be very sort of familiar with these. And of course, they're designed around kind of trying to measure key aspects of early child development and the kind of the family and wider environment. And importantly, we've got genetics on this, and I'll say a bit more about the saliva component of the study shortly. And of course, we wanted to embed kind of harmonization with other cohorts as well. So in terms of the instruments and the mode design, so this slide just shows the different interviews that we had. We had up to 4 interviews per child or per baby. So we had a primary informant interview, which was usually which was in the household where the baby spends most time, and it was usually with the parent. The intention was to do this with the parent who spends most time caring for the baby. So the eligibility for the primary informant interview was not based on relationship to the baby or gender or sex of the parent. It was based on which of the parents spends most time caring for the baby. And this should be done face-to-face, and it was about a 60-minute interview. We also had Teams and telephone available as well. And as I've already mentioned, there was a shorter interview for the non-response survey. We also had additional informants in the baby's main household, which was usually the co-resident, the other parent, or the partner of the primary informant, and this could be either face-to-face or web. It was a shorter interview because we didn't have to ask things about the family and the baby to the additional informant. So this was mostly about their relationship with the baby and their experiences specifically. And then we also have the own household parent interviews as well, which is for parents living elsewhere. Again, this is not always, but usually fathers. And it was about a 40-minute interview, which we tried to get face-to-face where possible. And we also have the possibility of an additional informant, like a co-resident partner of their own household parent. So in principle, there was up to these four different interviews with different modes, although primarily face-to-face. So this slide shows the questionnaire content. So and there's some color coding there. So the blue is the topics that were asked of all respondents, and the kind of grey is the primary informants only, and the green is PI, is what is asked of the sort of household level modules that are asked of the PIs and the OHPs. Again, I kind of won't read out all the different kind of topics on the slide, but you can see for yourself that they kind of cover kind of a lot of the kind of main areas that we would want to kind of collect data on about this for this type of study. I'll just mention two things quickly: the saliva and the data linkage. So I'll say a bit more about the data linkage later on, but we included consents to link to administrative data, and we also included a saliva sample collection for a subsample of families, and which again I'll come on to a bit later on. So we can move on. Yeah, this slide I think is just to say that we have included obviously some as you would expect, some kind of key standardized measures where possible in terms of some of these kind of key measures of development. And so yeah, we can move on, I think. So some findings. So first of all, in terms of the overall response to the study, so this is the sample sizes in terms of the number of families that we recruited into the study, and we're defining families here as sort of recruited families as being where we got either a primary informant or an additional informant interview in the baby's main household. In almost all of these families, but not all of them, that means that we got a primary informant interview, but there were a very small number of families where we actually just got an additional informant interview, but not a primary informant interview. So you can see the sample sizes on the screen here. So it's almost 2,000 families recruited to the feasibility study. So it's quite a large feasibility study, and over 90% of the families were recruited during the main field work, but we also got a good number and a good proportion as part of the non-response survey. There were also a number of families which are not included here on this slide. There were about 15 families where we had an OHP, an own household parent interview only, but we didn't get an interview in the baby's main household. So in terms of response rate, so this slide shows the response rates, again, based on that same definition. You can see that overall the response rates were by country here, listed on the slide, and there are two different response rates shown. So we're showing the field response rate in the sort of pink colour and the study response rate in the sort of blue colour. And the difference is, I think I mentioned earlier that the first stage of the recruitment approach was an opt-out letter, which was sent in advance of the fieldwork. So the study response rate kind of incorporates, sort of essentially treats those opt-outs as refusals and includes them in the proportion, whereas the field response rate is only looking at the cases who were issued to the field, so where is excluding the opt-outs where families had opted out prior to the fieldwork starting. So you can see that there are some country differences here, with England being lower than the other countries, and you can also see that for most countries the study response rate is similar to the field response rate. The country in which that's different is Northern Ireland, and that reflects the fact that in Northern Ireland the opt-out was sent by the data controllers rather than by Ipsos, and the opt-out rate therefore was higher, which meant that more of the kind of non-response happened kind of before the fieldwork. So that's why you see those slightly different patterns there. But overall, I think the response rates that we achieved were kind of as expected, and as we had anticipated at the start of the study. In terms of the England response rate being lower than the other countries, I mentioned earlier that in England we have a very significant kind of ethnic minority boost and a low-income boost. So we have looked, the response rates that are shown here are unweighted, so they're not adjusted for the sample design. But we have looked separately, and while the sample design in England and the kind of the boost sample of the low income and ethnic minority groups does make some difference, it's not really explaining the country differences. So we think there is the kind of real country difference here reflected in the response rates. So as I mentioned earlier, we can, because we've got some information about the families and the baby on the sampling frame, we can kind of compare our weighted achieved sample to the population estimate. So I've got a few slides on that. So we can see here some comparisons. In red is the combined weighted achieved sample, in blue is the population estimate. So most of the characteristics that we look at, there are very minimal differences. And then if we can move to the next slide. But we can also see that there are some characteristics we have overrepresented in our sample compared to the population estimate in terms of our kind of the current weighted achieved sample. And the next slide also shows that kind of white British births are slightly underrepresented when we weight them up compared to the relative population. But I think we're also working currently on the weights as well to try to do more work to improve that. So this slide just shows the who the respondents were in the sense of what their relationship was to the baby. So the primary informant, as I mentioned, the selection into the primary informant wasn't based on the gender or the relationship, but the majority of the primary informants were the child's biological mother, around about 90%, slightly over 90%. And the additional informant was usually just over 90% was the biological father of the child. And we've blanked out the numbers there for the own household family parents because they were quite small numbers, but the majority of them were fathers, biological fathers. And this slide just shows the actual mode of interview by the type of interview. So the primary informant, again, over 90% of the interviews were conducted face-to-face. The additional informant, which I mentioned earlier, was, sorry, just to clarify this, this slide is just showing the mode for the main fieldwork. So it's excluding the non-response survey, which was web only. So it's excluding those cases. So the additional informant I mentioned was a push-to-web approach. So push to face-to-face approach. So but with a web option, if the additional informants were wanted and preferred to do it, use it using an online survey. So that was around, you can see on the slide, majority of them were conducted face-to-face, but we had quite a significant proportion on the web also. Known household fathers, it was a little bit more distributed between the different modes. But I think the other thing that we found interesting on this slide is that there were quite a reasonably high proportion of telephone interviews as well, across all the different kind of modes. Yeah. So when we look at measurement and data quality, overall, we find good levels of data quality, so low levels of missingness, high levels of completion rates, and the reliability estimates were all good. So we've got a few slides just to show this, which I'll go through relatively quickly. So in terms of data quality, this is just showing the proportion of interviews that were full interviews compared with partial interviews. So you can see there are small, again, almost all of the interviews were full interviews with just kind of a few percent as partial interviews. And in terms of data quality, in terms of item missingness, most of the questions showed very low levels of item missingness. That's people saying that they don't know, prefer not to say. And yeah, I think we do see some patterning in terms of some particular, which again, I think we would expect questions that were more sensitive or harder to recall showed a higher amount of missingness. So, for example, here we've got household income, which was one of the sort of higher levels of missingness, in particular ethnic minority families, and had a higher rate of missingness on household income, and also units of alcohol, slightly higher rate of item missingness, with in particular amongst younger parents. But again, the base sizes here are relatively small, so I think we would caution against sort of over interpretation of some of these differences. And then in terms of reliability, we looked at the internal consistency, so the Cronbach's alpha score for the different scales, and as you can see, they are all pretty high, which is good. And we also have compared some of these with each other, and they kind of correlate with each other in the expected direction. Okay, so incentives. I mentioned earlier that we included some incentives, and we actually included an experiment in relation to the incentive design, which is described here on the slide. So we included both conditional and unconditional incentives. For the unconditional incentive, there were essentially 3 different treatment groups. So there was no unconditional incentive. There was a £5 note, so literally a £5 note included in the envelope for each named parent. And there was also baby's bib, which is modelled here by Estella from Ipsos, and that was also included in the envelope that was sent as part of the invitation mailing. And in terms of the conditional incentives, we had two different groups, so a £10 incentive or a £20 incentive. So families were randomised into these 6 different groups. Everybody in the same family got the same amount. And the letter that parents were sent told them kind of how much their incentive would be. And in terms of the results, so this is just some very kind of initial kind of raw descriptive. So in terms of looking at the kind of raw data in terms of the different groups, you can see that the highest response rate was in group 4, which is highlighted there, which is where there's a £5 unconditional incentive and a £20 conditional incentive. So as you might perhaps maybe that's, I think, not unexpected that the kind of the unconditional incentive of the £5 note with the higher value conditional incentive had the sort of highest response rate. I think we were interested that in particular looking at comparing group 1, which was then with group 5. So the kind of the unconditional incentive condition where we didn't send any unconditional incentive performed better than the group 5 where they were sent to bib in advance. So that was interesting to us. However, I would also just caution here as well, as you can see, we haven't included any confidence intervals on the response rates as yet. So that's something we'll be looking into a bit more detail. So these are small sample sizes, so we need to look in a bit more detail at the confidence intervals. In terms of that, one more thing to mention in terms of the incentives is the conditional, it's around the non-response survey. So for England and Wales, the incentive that was offered for the non-response survey was the same value as for the main part of the fieldwork. But for Scotland and Northern Ireland, we actually offered a higher incentive for the non-response phase, which was, so we added additional £10 for all the families. So if they had originally been offered 10, they would be offered 20. If they'd originally been offered 20, they'd be offered 30. And for the the families in lower income areas, that was actually an additional £20 rather than an additional £10. So they were offered a higher incentive, and they actually offered a higher incentive for a shorter web interview in the case of the primary informant. The non-response survey web interview was only 40 minutes compared to 60 minutes in the main fieldwork. And the next slide just shows some, again, very initial kind of descriptive findings on this. So you can see that in basically in Scotland and Northern Ireland, where we had this higher incentive for the non-response phase, it looks like the increase in the overall response rate that we during the non-response survey phase was a bit higher, 5.2 in Scotland and 4.3 in Northern Ireland, compared to about 3% in England and Wales. Again, these are small sample sizes, but it does seem to be indicative that the kind of higher value incentive had kind of led to a sort of higher response rate to the non-response survey. And of course, it wasn't an experiment, it was a randomized experiment in the sense it was just a kind of natural experiment between those different countries. Okay, on to saliva. We included a saliva sample collection in the study. So biological parents were asked to provide a saliva sample for themselves, and the primary informant was asked to give consent for their baby's saliva as well. And yeah, so these were sent to a research lab and DNA has been extracted, and we're hoping to genotype them in the future. And we kind of developed the protocols, particularly for the baby collection, which involved a sort of swab that was administered by the parent in the baby's mouth. We developed a sort of pilot. We did a mini pilot to test those protocols. There was a £5 incentive offered per person or per sample. So this was quite innovative because although we have collected saliva samples in other birth cohorts and in other types of studies, It's the first time we've included the request for saliva at the beginning of a cohort. So we were interested in including it. And it's also the first time that I think we've, certainly on a large-scale study that we were aware of, where we've saliva samples have been collected from babies. So we wanted to include this in the study because of obviously the importance of kind of genetics and genetic factors in children's development. So it'd be great to be able to include this at the beginning of the study. We wanted to test it, so we tested it on a randomized subsample of families because we wanted to look at the impact that including the request for saliva might have on their overall participation in the study or their willingness to take part. And we also wanted to have a look at what the take-up rates were. So the way in which the saliva kind of element was introduced was that we wanted to introduce it in a kind of gradual kind of way, so it wasn't so as not to overburden sort of families. So in the initial study guide information that was sent to all families with part of the invitation letter, there was just a very short paragraph about the saliva element. And then when the interviewer visited, they provided this another leaflet about the saliva element, which you can see on the screen there as a 4-page leaflet about how to be part of research about genes. And then during the household visit, the interviewer aimed to collect the samples in the household if possible. And there was a sort of script and more leaflets as well for the interviewers and for the families to use. And then it was returned in the post to the lab. And when we received a saliva sample back, then an incentive was sent in the post to the families. So this slide shows the response rates by the saliva component. So you can see that we do have confidence intervals sort of on these slides, and you can see that the biosample component families are on the first bar and the non-biosample families on the second bar. So the confidence intervals are overlapping. So but it certainly is. We think this overall is reassuring in the sense that we did not observe a significantly lower response rate from the biosamples in this. But as I mentioned, the confidence intervals are overlapping. The saliva collection. So this slide just shows the completion rates for the saliva sample, and again it shows by country and by parents and babies. So we've got the consent rate, which is those who agreed to do it amongst eligible families, the return rates, so whether they actually returned a saliva sample, and also then the sort of sum of the two, so the overall completion rate. Excuse me just one moment. So overall you can see that the completion rate was slightly higher for parents than for babies, and you can see that there were also some some quite large country differences there, which we think is due in part to the fact that we were able to sort of adapt and kind of change the protocols during the fieldwork period. So in particular, Scotland and Northern Ireland started a bit later than England and Wales. So we had emphasised much more, I think, to interviewers or during that phase, the importance of, in particular, trying to get the saliva during the visit. But I think we also feel that the differences may also reflect some underlying country differences as well. And in particular, there was also some patterning by ethnicity and with some Asian groups in particular, minority ethnic groups less likely to agree, and also by low income with lower rates amongst low income families. Okay, administrative data linkages. So we, yes, asked consent for linking to health, education, and social care records for the primary informants, the additional informants, for all of the different informants and the babies. And it was retrospective and prospective, and you can see that the duration was shown there for the baby is only up until 14 for health and 16 for education. Excuse me. And so this slide just shows the information that was given as part of the study guide. So we included an experiment with 2 different ways of collecting consent. So we had then opt-in consent arm as part of this experiment, where essentially there was a kind of a module towards the end of the interview where the interviewer went through each of the consent questions one by one and asked explicitly whether they were willing to give permission for this education for each of the different consent types. And we also had an opt-out approach where as at the beginning of the interview, just after the overall kind of consent to this taking part in the interview was gained, the interviewer explained that as part of the study we would be linking their survey responses to their administrative records, and it explained how they can go online after the interview to make their choices about whether they about this. They also the interviewer was also able to record a spontaneous refusal in the interview. So we wanted to trial these 2 different approaches, and the 2 different approaches were kind of developed via extensive public engagement work, where we found that both approaches were acceptable to parents as long as choice was emphasised, and also that there was transparency with parents. Okay, so this slide just shows the comparison of the opt-in and opt-out approaches. So you can, and this is for parents. So overall, you can see that the opt-out approach has higher consent rates, and you can also see that the opt-in approach. But you can also see that for both the opt-in approach and the opt-out approach, the consent rates were high. You can see that in England, the opt-in consent rates were proportionately quite a bit lower compared to the opt-out consent rates than in other countries. So in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, the opt-in consent rates are more similar to the opt-out consent rates, whereas in England they're quite a bit lower. And the next slide, I think, shows that this is again not due to the design differences. Again, I mentioned earlier that we had the oversampling of the low income and ethnic minority families in England, and I think we don't think that is the kind of main explanation of why England had slightly lower opt-in rates, consent rates, although it's sort of part of the story, but not the major factor. And I think I've got a few other slides about the different data linkage consent rates, but I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to if we could just move on, Steph, into the last section, because I want to make sure we have enough time to cover the engagement and inclusivity. Thanks very much. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the sort of public engagement was very important for the feasibility study to ensure, I think the value of the study, acceptability, and participant co-production, and that involved data users, parents of young children, and also young children themselves. In terms of our general approach to public engagement work, we were very committed to ensuring that the views of potential participants and data data users were, as well as being heard, they were actually incorporated, and that we changed things in response to the findings. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about that. But all of the information about all of the reports that we did, and the public engagement work, is included on the website. is available on the CLS website. So yeah, as I mentioned, we've been working on this project for a few years now. So back at the beginning of the project in 2021 and 2022, we have done quite a very extensive scientific consultation with potential data users, and again, and that we've around the kind of development of the questionnaire, and the questionnaires were published on the website, and full information around that kind of work is available on the website. In terms of public engagement work that we did with parents and young people, I've already mentioned the first one of these, which was around some work that we did with Kantar Public, then now Varian, around the acceptability of using administrative data. So that was around the acceptability of using the sampling frame, and also that was around the acceptability of using information on the sampling frame for non-response analysis, and also this helped us to develop the 2 different consent models that I mentioned. And we worked with the National Children's Bureau, who have got a parent panel and a youth advisory panel, and we met with those groups 3 times during the development of the project to explore kind of wider issues around participant engagement. We worked with our branding company Hudson Fuggle, and also the IFF Research to test and develop the study name and brand. And we also worked with Ipsos on, in particular, doing some qualitative work with the target kind of groups for some of the key target groups for the early life cohort feasibility study. So that was own household fathers, low-income parents, and in particular low-income parents from minority ethnic groups. And we, as part of the development process, we did some cognitive testing and also some materials testing. And for all of this work, we included mothers and fathers, and we aimed to include parents from a kind of diverse range of different backgrounds. Again, all of the reports from that work is on the study website, on the CLS website. Yeah, these were the kind of groups that we, the sort of less often heard groups that we were very mindful to kind of include and ensure that the study was engaged, was designed to be inclusive of. And I'm just going to go through a few of the design features that we incorporated into the study to do that. So the first bit is about accessible and inclusive materials. So the study branding, the study name was chosen in part because it was particularly popular amongst low-income families. They liked the simplicity and the self-explanatory nature of it. And also, the time we did this work a couple of years ago, COVID was, very forefront of people's minds, and the idea of a kind of new generation of new. Anyway, the name Generation Year really resonated. So across all of the work that we did, we found that these were the kind of key motivators for taking part. So social value, sharing experiences, diversity, time that the study involved, the commitment involved, trust, and also choice. And we tried to incorporate these different diverse engagement messaging throughout the materials. This slide shows the study guide, so the main leaflet that was given to the families. So we tried to incorporate, you can see, I think in some of the images there, we tried to incorporate diverse imaging, which was very, so that came through quite strongly, is the value of diversity in all of the families, that making sure that the fact that the study reflected the diversity of the UK population was important as an important motivator. We also wanted to include some to ensure that our messaging around engagement and participation resonated with fathers as well as mothers. So we would generally avoided using the word parents, and we instead preferred to talk about fathers and mothers, and include some tailoring for fathers. We wanted to ensure that the study was inclusive of families across the whole of the UK and all 4 nations. So in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, we had, as well as the kind of overall study director, Alyssa, the overall UK study director based at UCL. In each of the different countries, we had study co-directors who co-signed the letters, and the logo from their universities was included on the letters and also on the envelopes. And in terms of language, we looked carefully at which languages would be most important to include for the in terms of translations for the population that we were looking at. So we looked at in particular at the sample boost ethnic groups, but also more widely at the demography of parents with young children, and also language fluency amongst different ethnic minority groups. So we chose 10 different languages, and on the back of the study leaflet, we have this short text in each of those languages saying that there's more information available in those languages in translation on the study website. And the study website also had a plugin so that it could be translated, the Google Translate plugin. And we also had translated materials available on the website. We wanted the materials to be accessible, so we tested a range of different types. So we included a range of different types of materials. We made large print versions available, as well as plain text materials available. So that's where they were not designed, that the text was on essentially a white kind of plain background. And the website has an accessibility statement, and it was also designed to meet the web content accessibility guidance as well on accessibility. And in terms of the fieldwork protocols, there were various things that we tried to incorporate. So this slide is just around the kind of importance of flexibility, and bearing in mind that the families, in particular for low-income families, the kind of competing demands with work, often doing more than multiple jobs, family time, and we tried to kind of make sure that the interviewers were briefed to bear this in mind when they were making their calls. And also part of the reason for including the web option for the additional formats in particular was because of this. We explored whether to match interviews by ethnicity, which in the qualitative research showed that actually the participants or parents from minority ethnic groups did not like this idea because they felt it would increase social pressure. But we did provide some reassurance in the materials that the interviewers were experienced about in terms of talking to families in a range of different communities and from a range of different sort of social backgrounds. And throughout the materials, we were very keen to we made sure that we were emphasising that the choice at the heart of taking part in the study. So that was in relation to the taking part in the study overall, in relation to taking part in the different elements, in relation to the opt-out and the data linkage approaches. And we were also very transparent about the future and what the commitment was in terms of taking part now doesn't commit them to taking part in the future, but we also wanted to be transparent that it was an ongoing study. And in terms of the biosamples, we developed some tailored messaging to try to address those particular concerns. So, for example, amongst own household parents, then there was concern around paternity testing. So I included some reassurances about that, as well as having a kind of gradual approach to introducing the information about the biosamples, as well as videos and online FAQs. And then in terms of kind of vulnerable families, then we obviously had a safeguarding protocol, we had country-specific sources of support, and we also had to be informed health visitor networks in the countries as well. So we're now at the end of the feasibility study. We've carried out fieldwork successfully using the desired sampling frame in all 4 countries, which we think is a major achievement. I think the sampling frame that we have used for the study has not been used before for this purpose, and we had to negotiate with different data holders in England and Wales, with NHS England, and also different data holders in Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. So, the sort of time taken in the feasibility study was quite heavily weighted towards the beginning and the time that was needed for negotiating around access to the sort of sampling frame. So we've just been reporting back to the ESRC, to the funder, and we also plan to publish the findings for a wide audience, of course, as well. And then the ESRC will be taking a decision about commissioning the main study later this year, early next year. And if commissioned, the main study would hopefully begin towards the end of 2026 with a 12-month birth window provisionally, with babies being born from January in 2026 onwards. If you'd like to keep in touch and find out more, please join our mailing list. All of the materials I've shown today in terms of the participant materials are available on the participant website, which is gnestudy.info. And if you've got any questions, please get in touch with me. Drop me a line. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa, for this really comprehensive account of what's been done. That was fascinating. Just to say that there is still time for you to knock a couple of questions into the Q&A function if you'd like to, but I do have some already here for you, Lisa. Some of these you may have covered, but feel free to just reiterate. So there's a question from Karen that said, goes back to the very start of your talk, but when you talk about the kinds of families that are typically underrepresented in large-scale studies in terms of inclusion, what kind of families specifically were you indicating?
Yeah, so great question. So I think the study was, in terms of the sort of sample design for the study, the sort of less often heard groups that we had boosted for the study were the ethnic minority groups, so Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Black African and Black Caribbean, and also low-income families. Because while these groups have sometimes are included, in order to have sufficient sample sizes, we generally have needed to boost up those samples, and also we also know that particularly for low-income families, they might attrit at a higher rate as well. So it's important to get a kind of a large enough sort of sample at the beginning. But I think also more generally, I think we were and the funder were mindful that groups that are particularly of kind of policy interest often can be in sort of relatively small numbers, and I think that is in these kind of like large studies, or when it comes to very specific groups. And I think I'd mentioned the Children in Need project at the beginning, so that's one example of a group that where we have actually done some sort of separate scoping work, because I think that's one particular group of interest where I think if we were going to want to include them, then perhaps we would need a kind of separate study to kind of in particular to focus on that group from the outset. So yeah, I think that's but I think more generally, I think we were just very mindful of trying to design the study as being as inclusive as possible. Yeah.
Super, thanks. A couple of questions, both related to sort of the different modes used. So the first one is basically a query. Was it the same questionnaire and same questions formulated the same way in both face-to-face and in the web CATI options, or was there adaptation, I guess is the point?
Yeah, I mean, it was basically the same questions. Yeah, there was some minor adaptations for the mode and the presentation, as would be normal in, I think, in any kind of mixed mode survey. But there were essentially it was the same questionnaire. Yeah. And then we had the as I mentioned, we had the non-response follow-up phase at the beginning, at the end of the fieldwork, which was web only, and that was a shorter questionnaire for the primary informant. So there was
which is the next question.
Yeah.
Basically, Isabella would like to know a little bit more about that shorter interview, and in fact, I would as well. What was what was missing, if you like? What was the constitution of the non-response interview?
Yeah, good question. And I'm not sure I know the answer to it off the top of my head, actually, unfortunately. But I think but yeah, I think for the, so we did reduce the content, obviously from 60 minutes to 40 minutes. I think that the web questionnaire was probably, and respondents, I think, as can sometimes be quicker answering web questionnaires than face-to-face interviews as well. So although the duration was shorter on the web, it perhaps wasn't as much of a content cut, like, if you see what I mean, because we're comparing a sort of 60-minute face-to-face with a sort of 40-minute web. But yeah, I would have to get back to you on the detail, I'm afraid. Sorry about
that. So Rana asks, and you'd already told us about how many languages it was made available in. Rana wants to know, in terms of what did this yield? How many interviews in a language English did you actually get? Do you have a sense of the proportion?
Good question. Yeah, we did look at this, and we actually very few. And I think I also didn't, because I was rushing a bit towards the end, didn't mention that much on what our sort of language protocols were. So although the materials were available in translation, but we didn't for the feasibility study translate the actual instrument into minority languages. We had a translation protocol where interviewers and also within household translators could translate. But we have looked at the number of interviews that were done in translation. I don't have the number at the right now at the front top of my head, but it was small. It was pretty small. Yeah.
Okay, a couple of questions re incentives from Zuzig. Did you experience any ethical or practical issues with issuing the £5 note incentive? And was the additional incentive also cash, or was it a voucher?
Good questions. So the conditional incentive was a voucher. It wasn't cash. It did experience, well, so for the feasibility study, because the sample size was relatively small, I think we're able to kind of administer the sort of £5 cash incentive in terms of actually stuffing it in envelopes. But I think that is because I think that's what obviously needed to happen. But you saw that the response rate overall was only around about 50%. So kind of, there were quite a lot of envelopes posted out with £5 notes in them, which didn't result in an interview. I think that is one of the things that we're thinking about for the main study. Should it be commissioned? That if it was, which I think would likely be a much larger sample. So I think the feasibility and the sort of practicability of doing the cash unconditional incentive is something that I think we would need to consider, or would need to be considered. And then I think the other thing was I think we didn't particularly have any strong ethical concerns about the unconditional incentive being cash rather than a voucher that I can recall. I thought you were going to ask about the higher value incentive for the non-response follow-up, because I think that was the other thing that was I think we offering a sort of higher incentive as part of a non-response follow-up for a shorter interview was something that we needed to obviously go back to the ethics committee to change the protocol. And actually the reason why England and Wales had one protocol and Scotland and Northern Ireland had the other protocol was because we needed to go back to the ethics committee, and we weren't able to do that in time for England and Wales, but we did for Scotland and Northern Ireland. But we certainly haven't had any yet. Anyway, so I'll stop there. Yeah.
Okay, super. And we're pushing the time envelope. There's one final question, one close to my heart. In developing the design and measures, were you able to look at overseas birth cohort studies with a view to maximising opportunities for comparative analysis?
Oh yes, yeah. We were able to do that. We were able to do that. We also obviously looked within the UK to back at the Millennium Cohort Study And also some people will know about the Department of Education Children of the 2020 study as well, which is an England-only birth cohort. So I think those were our sort of primary aims to be comparable with, but we did look at overseas cohorts for sure. And also the GUIDE project as well, which was people may know about, which is aiming to set up a European comparative birth cohort study.
Thanks, Lisa. So thank you again for answering all those questions and for a very interesting talk. Hope everybody enjoyed that. Thanks to everyone who's participated. We'll be back here on the Thursday, the 12th of December, when we'll be looking at the WHO's sexual health questionnaire. But until then, from everybody in London, it's thank you and good afternoon.